Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you in person, but I'm really looking forward to all the things that we're going to go over today in shark fisheries management and conservation. My name is Megan Holst. I'm a PhD student in Dr. John Duran's lab at UC Davis in the Graduate Group of Ecology. I'm also a senior biologist at Aquarium of the Bay, and all of my dissertation work that I do for my PhD happens at my full-time job there at the aquarium. So you'll see some photos of me working there. Now, my study species for my PhD dissertation is the broad-nosed seven-gill shark. Now, broad-nosed seven-gill sharks are really cool. They're actually considered an apex predator. They will sometimes compete with even white sharks for resources, especially when their habitats overlap. They're typically a deep water species, but they come up into shallow bays and estuaries for important parts of their life history, like when they need to breed or when they need to pup, which is what we call when they give birth. So San Francisco Bay is actually the only place in the world where we currently know of where we can readily find the pups and the juveniles and the subadults, because San Francisco Bay is a pupping and nursery ground for the seven-gill shark. And that is really, really cool, especially with a deep water shark where you don't normally have access to the adults. So it allows us to ask some really important questions about their life history because they're really readily accessible in San Francisco Bay. So we have all the wide ranges of size. You can see I'm pulling blood from a juvenile pup on the bottom right-hand corner. That animal was probably born earlier this year. And so it's probably roughly around 3 or 4 months old. The one in the middle is a juvenile still. Anything that I can hold by myself is definitely still probably a juvenile. On the left-hand side, you can see just the tail of an adult. It gets kind of hard for us to take pictures of adults when usually it's all hands on deck when we have a large animal on board, so we don't have extra hands to take pictures. But I thought it was cool to at least just see the size difference with the tail. And that's our research vessel on the top right-hand corner. It's a 29-foot aluminum, what we call a Radin type boat. And that is what we fish for seven-gill sharks in San Francisco Bay. And we have some equipment that you'll see throughout some of these slides where we conduct our research. But before we really dive in more into the nitty-gritty of shark conservation, I kind of want to gauge where you guys are at. Now, obviously, this isn't live, but I know what time this lecture is going to be viewed. And so at 11 a.m. Pacific time on Friday, I will be live tweeting along when I think this recording is going to be going. So I'll ask some of these questions, and you're welcome to find me on my Twitter page. I have it on the bottom right-hand corner. I'll also try to do something in my Instagram stories and just prompt some of these same questions, and you're welcome to engage there and see what other people come up with. Hopefully, if everything goes right, I will be doing that unless something comes up. But that is what the current plan. So the first question I want to ask is, how many shark species do you know? So this isn't a trick question. If you have a pen and paper, please do go ahead and pull that out and just write down all the species that you know of. Or if you want to tweet it out, that's great too. Just tweet out every species that you can think of. And I just want to see how many that you can come up with. So I'm going to do that with you right now. We'll give you about 30 seconds to write down what you can think of, and we'll come back and I'm going to talk about which ones I think you probably wrote down. Okay, I think that's all the time I'm going to give us for now. So there are typically a few species that people can always think of, and that's what I really wanted to see, is if you guys pulled kind of those same species of sharks. Let me know if you end up having some of these sharks that I'm going to go ahead and list now, which is the great white, the bull shark, the hammerhead shark, which is on our screen right now, so that was definitely a little hint, a tiger shark, And, I know that there's definitely another really common one I'm just not even thinking of right now, but I wrote down a thresher. So if you wrote down any species, any one of those 5 sharks, do let me know. And then the next question I want to ask you is, do you think that sharks are in need of conservation? This is something I would always like to ask a group because you get a reference for people's knowledge about how many sharks might be out there and what they might know about sharks. So I just want you to kind of think about that for a second. Do you think that sharks need to be conserved? And think about why you have that opinion right now. If you think they need to be conserved, what information are you pulling from that brings you to that conclusion? And if you think, no, they don't need to be managed, I think there's a lot of them or they cause a lot of harm and therefore it's not a problem to pull them out of the environment. Just keep those things in mind as we go through. So the first thing that I want to point out to you is how many species of sharks there are. Now, typically, the average person can't name more than 5 species of shark. If you named more than 5 species of shark, then go ahead and pat yourself on the back. That is really great. If you are one of the very unique individuals that might really be enthusiastic about sharks, you could probably name 10 or more. If you were able to name more than 15 species of shark, I definitely want to get to know you. You are certainly probably a shark enthusiast. So that's really great. But there are actually 500 species of shark that have been described. There are likely many more that we're still describing. There's still definitely room for researching the different species of sharks and rays in the world. Now, as of 2021, this year, the IUCN Red List, which regulates and assesses a lot of populations based on their conservation status, they have assessed that 36% of sharks and rays are currently threatened, meaning they're either vulnerable to extinction, they're endangered, or they're critically endangered. So I have some stats listed there on the screen for you. 76 sharks and rays are critically endangered, 112 are endangered, and 167 species of sharks and rays are vulnerable. And when they get that status, that means they're typically critically endangered or vulnerable to extinction within 3 generations. And it takes a lot of data to really assess those species and make those predictions on whether or not they're vulnerable for extinction or not. So those are just the species that have been assessed. That's not all the species. And the species that I've listed there for how many are critically endangered, et cetera, that's for sharks and rays. Whereas again, there's over 500 species of just shark. So these are just the species that we've assessed. There's still a lot of work to do to really know where we're at with a lot of sharks and rays. So just wanted to give you that reference. So they definitely do need to be conserved. I want to make that clear. There's a lot of species that are really hurting, especially when we were overfishing them, especially historically. We used to have absolutely no regulations, as I'm sure you know, on many fisheries. And when we want to conserve species, we have to really think and be critical about how we want to conserve, how we're going to target and design conservation around a species, because each species is going to be different. We can't even have the same management plan for all sharks because not all sharks behave the same way or act the same way or need the same resources. So we have to be really unique to the needs of each individual species. The other thing that's really unique about shark conservation that's not necessarily the same as other species that we might need to consider conserve in shark conservation or in fisheries management is that a lot of shark species are very long-lived, but they're also late to mature. And when they do reproduce, they're only reproducing a couple of young. So that makes them especially unique for conservation because a lot of times we're taking those animals out much, much quicker than they're possibly able to put back into the environment. Most shark species can only have maybe 1 or 2 pups at a time. The other thing that I just want to mention, and I don't know if I'll have an opportunity to mention it later, is how diverse all these species are. There's 500 species, and they're not all your great white shark or your bull shark or your tiger shark. You know, those are really big apex predators, but a lot of shark species, actually most of them, are not apex predators. They're what we call mesopredators. They're in the middle of that food chain. They're smaller, and actually I think the average size, total length from the rostrum, which is the tip of their nose, to the end of their tail, the total length average for sharks is I think around 3 or 4 feet. It's pretty small. So there's a bonnethead shark that I'm pulling blood from on the bottom right-hand corner there. And they don't get a whole lot bigger than that. They're pretty small sharks, whereas the bull shark on the left-hand side that I'm pulling from, those obviously get a lot bigger. But there's a lot of diversity within those. And even hammerhead sharks, if you wrote down hammerhead, the picture that I showed, and probably the species that you're thinking of is the great hammerhead. But even within hammerheads, there's 5 species. And the bonnethead here is the smallest species of hammerhead shark. They're also, I just want to shout the bonnethead out for a second, because they're also the only known omnivorous shark that we've been able to record so far. We have done some studies and seen that they do in fact eat seagrass, and scientists thought maybe they were eating seagrass because they weren't finding anything else and they were just trying to fill their gut with something, but they do in fact digest and use the nutritional resources from seagrass. So it does look like they are our first omnivorous species of shark that has been recorded. So that's just an extra cool thing that I'll throw out there. Okay, so then what are current threats to sharks? So again, I want you to kind of internalize and think about, what do you think is threatening sharks? And I'm usually looking for something specific for this. Again, you're welcome to write that down and just kind of think about what you think the main concerns for sharks are. I think we'll probably hit on the one that you're worried about, and we'll just talk about the threats in general for sharks. So think about that for another about 5 seconds here. Write it down. Again, you're welcome to tweet me about it. Okay, so we're going to go over some of the main threats to sharks. And a lot of you probably think overfishing, which is absolutely true. Historically, we have absolutely wiped out a lot of species of shark. On the right-hand side there, you see the soupfin shark. It is native to our coastline. It also comes into San Francisco Bay. It's a beautiful, beautiful animal. And they're currently critically endangered. We nearly fished them to extinction when it was really common to fish them for their liver oil, but they're still fished. Actually, people in San Francisco Bay still actively fish for this shark. So that's something that we'll talk about a little bit later. But overfishing is definitely a problem, and it wasn't just historically a problem, it's still a problem. So that's something that we're constantly trying to research more about so that we can combat a lot of unsustainable overfishing that is currently happening. The other big threat to sharks is bycatch. Not just targeted fishing, but a lot of fishers will be targeting a smaller species, and the nets or the gear types that they're using will also get bycatch, and sharks are really, really prone to being a common bycatch, and a lot of times they're not even utilized. When they are bycatch, they just die on the line and then they're tossed aside, which is really, really unfortunate because, again, long-lived species, late to mature, and that's another animal out of the population that's not going to reproduce back into the population. We fish 100 million sharks every single year, still to this day. Technology continues to get better with fishing, which is just a problem with fishing in general. And another thing that I'm sure a lot of you thought about, if you've heard of shark finning, shark fins are very highly valuable and they have a really high market value. If you think about shark fishing, and especially with shark finning, a lot of people want to jump to conclusions and typically accuse some of our Asian countries for starting a lot of these practices, but that's really not true. Actually, 126 countries actively target sharks, including the United States. However, the top 20 countries that are targeting sharks are also responsible for 80% of the global annual catch. So that's discouraging and encouraging at the same time, because that means that there's less countries to potentially coordinate with a collaborative effort to conserve sharks. And I think that is potentially good news when there's the fewer number of countries that are responsible for the majority of shark fishing. Obviously, there's work to do in every country, and 126 countries, if we can, getting us all to collaborate together can often be very hard to do. Now, all the shark fishing that we do globally is responsible for $100 billion worth of market shark trade. So the next question I would want to ask you, and again, you're welcome to write this down, think about it. Do you think sustainable shark fisheries are possible? After we just talked about that. Again, think about their life history. They're these long-lived fish. Sometimes they're apex predators, but not all of them are. Do you even think it's possible that we could fish sharks sustainably? And maybe why even would we want to do that? Models actually indicate, and experience that scientists are conducting is indicating that there is sustainable exploitation of sharks, just like any other fishery. And again, I really want to encourage everyone to take a step back for a second. A lot of people have assumptions about shark fishing and eating sharks and shark finning. I'm sure that you have an opinion about that. We all absolutely do, and we all have biases about that. However, sharks are fish and people eat sharks. That is a very normal thing globally. There are some countries that is their primary protein source. And so I would encourage you to not condemn people immediately if that is their primary food source. It might also be one of the more sustainable ways for them to get protein, which we'll talk about in a moment. There are several real world examples of sustainable shark fisheries, and that includes the U.S. Atlantic blacktip that's on the right-hand side of our screen right now. That is actually one of the most sustainable fisheries in the United States. The reason for that is that a lot of times fishers, to get these sharks, are doing hook and line, meaning that they have just a rod and reel, they're putting down a single hook, and then they'll feel an animal as soon as it's on that line and they'll pull the animal up. And that shortens the timeline of an animal being on that line. If it's something that they don't want, they can let it go. The animal is more likely to survive if it's from just that hook and line. But you also don't get bycatch. If you're just getting the one thing you wanted, you'll pull up the shark that you want. You're not catching anything else. And then you get a lot of protein for one individual animal that you're getting, which it can be really beneficial. So the Atlantic blacktip is actually one of the most sustainable fisheries. That's a good example for shark fishing. And again, I think I mentioned earlier that 7-gill sharks are actually also readily fished in San Francisco Bay. People eat soup fin sharks still, and people eat 7-gill sharks. Now, that's not necessarily to say that every shark fishery is sustainable, because it's not. I don't think that every species is the same and every location is not going to be the same. We have to treat every location uniquely and every shark species uniquely, and only fish sustainably based on the needs of that individual species in the location that we're fishing them. So we have to be really smart about this. There's absolutely not going to be a one size fits all. And I work with a lot of fishers in San Francisco Bay Area. And one of the first questions that a lot of them often ask me is this sustainable? Are we keeping up with the population? What's interesting about that is that I don't currently know. I don't really have a strong answer for that. I think what we're going to continue to talk about is that you need a lot of data to really understand how fishing affects a population. And so if we're not careful, we might be overfishing before we even have the data to really know if we're overfishing that animal. It's not to say that it's not possible to sustainably do it, but we should be very proactive about what that species needs before it's too late and before we have to turn around or before it's critically endangered. I do think that we're doing better with a lot of species, including the soup fin shark. People do eat those as well. They are critically endangered. However, I believe that the population is increasing, and I've heard some pretty positive things from local scientists about that population. So it seems that even though we are fishing them a little bit, it is currently, they're still able to rebound their population, which is a great sign. That would indicate that it might be a sustainable fishery if the population is able to replace itself, even though we're pulling from it. Okay, so how do we catch sharks? We just talked about hook and lines, right? And there's lots of different gear types that people will use to fish for sharks. And there are different ways that we can regulate how people get sharks that can help support sustainable fisheries and reduce the amount of animals that we're taking out of the water. First is by permitting. The US does regulate permits, and including fishing for sharks, and they can limit how many permits they put out there or how many people can get the permits. It might be first come, first serve. There might be a long process to get on a waiting list or something before you can get one of those permits. There can also be quotas, like size limits. There can also be what we call slot limits, where there's just one size class that might be prohibited, like a sexually mature female. Like the females over this size are not ones that you can take from the wild because they're busy reproducing and we want them to continue to do that. Or total catch limits, that's a really common one as well. There's also gear restrictions. So there's been a lot of improvement with our fisheries in changing the gear that we use to fish for sharks and making it more sustainable. There are some really easy ways to do that, including lengthening the line, for example, on long lines. Now, if you aren't aware, a long line this is like a little cartoon version of a long line where it's quite literally that. It's a long length of line. And there's buoys that keep the line kind of near the surface and anchored within the water column. And then there's hooks that are coming off of that line all down the line. Now, some permitting might restrict how many hooks you can put on a line or how long the line can be. Maybe it can only be 50 meters, for example, and you have to spread out each hook a certain amount of distance or something. Or one thing that has been encouraged is lengthening the line, what we call the long line leads, where the hook is actually coming off of the main long line. And if you lengthen that, that can be really beneficial because a lot of sharks are what we call obligate ram ventilators, which means that they have to continually swim to breathe. And if we lengthen that line for them, then they're able to continue to swim around and be able to breathe, which can really increase their survival rate. So if it is bycatch, if it's not a species that we want to keep, then when we take it off, when we pull the long line in, that animal's chances of survival is much higher. We can release them and hopefully they're going to go ahead and survive because they had a long enough line to continue to swim during that time. There's lots of different things that we can do with permitting or restricting or modifying gear, even hook types. If you've ever gone fishing, you maybe have used what's called a J hook. It's literally in the shape of a J, or you might have used a circle hook where the barb part of that hook actually curves back in. That can be really beneficial, especially for gut hooking a shark. That a circle hook can prevent the barb of that hook actually going into the stomach lining if the shark swallows the hook and you're able to actually pull the hook back out. Whereas if it's a J hook, it might be more likely to get inside the actual gut and then tear into the stomach, which would obviously not be as beneficial. So there's ways to modify all types of gears that we have. And of course, there's also specific area management. So like a nursery ground, like San Francisco Bay. If we find that 7 gills are rapidly declining and they are currently classified as vulnerable. So they're definitely not in the worst case scenario, but we do think they're declining. And maybe an easy way to help protect that population is by protecting just where those young of the year, 1 year juveniles are and saying, we can't fish this area. We need these animals to get past year 1 because that's the hardest year. And then after that, then maybe again, there could be slot limits or you just stay away from this area where the really young juveniles are. So that can be a really easy way too to protect the very vulnerable individuals within the population. Okay, now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into shark finning because this is definitely a really big topic. This is one of the more emotionally driven things. People get really invested about shark finning, and so I want to dedicate some time to talking about it. But first, I want to define shark finning. Shark finning is the act of actually removing the fins and discarding the body at sea. Typically, the animal is often still alive when this happens. So I should have put a little content warning on this, perhaps. This is a rather gruesome photo, but this is, again, pretty common with shark finning. They will cut the fins off because it's a really high market value, and then they'll toss the rest of the body. The shark finning does not include when people take the whole animal back and then take the fins off after the animal has been landed. That's for a really important reason, which we'll talk about actually in the next slide. So here you see a lot of fins in baskets that somebody has been carrying around, probably from the vessel. There's lots of different regulations that you can put on shark finning to ideally reduce how it affects the entire population of sharks. And one regulation is commonly used called fins naturally attached, which means that you can only sell fins if you took the fins off of the shark once the animal was brought back to land, meaning you cannot cut the fins off at sea. It means that you have to bring the animal all the way back to land and then take the fins off. Now that can help with regulations for multiple reasons. One, it means that the fishers have to bring the whole body back to shore, which likely means that they have less room to store fins, right? Because now there's the whole shark is taking up room on the vessel instead of having compact fins where they can just put all the fins in a basket or in a tighter holding area as opposed to the whole body. So maybe they're taking less sharks because they don't have as much room. That's kind of the thought, one of the thoughts behind that regulation. The other thing is that people, again, eat shark. And so if you require that they bring back the whole body, it encourages the use of the whole animal and selling and making use of the whole animal, and then also being able to profit off the fins, but also feeding people a really great source of protein. So that can be beneficial also to the community. Now, it doesn't necessarily limit actually how many sharks you're removing from the water. It's not specific enough. You're not actually addressing, again, how many animals are removed. You're just limiting maybe how many a certain boat could hold. So it's not specific enough to really limit how many animals are pulled from the environment. So if people use the shark naturally attached regulation, they need some complementary regulations to help support actual reduction of the removal of sharks. The limitation to this ban is that it does not prevent sharks from being caught. People are still going to catch sharks. They're just going to, it just changes their behavior and how the animal is killed and sold. But again, there's a limitation there. If the goal is that a shark is not being harvested sustainably, then we must change how we're doing this. And yeah, this might not necessarily work by just trying to force them to bring the whole animal back. It could, but not entirely. The other type of regulations are by how you fish for that animal, maybe even just sports fisheries. This photo to the right actually really blew up on Twitter a couple of months ago. This woman, I believe, got cited. You cannot fish for great hammerheads in Florida. Actually, you might be able to fish for them, but you absolutely cannot allow their gills to come out of the water. You have to remove the line as quickly as possible with the animal underwater and release them as quickly as possible. Great hammerhead sharks are incredibly sensitive. They have some of the most sensitive physiology of any shark that we've researched. And if their gills are out of water at all, the likelihood of that animal dying increases exponentially. So that is actually a really great and easy regulation if people abide by it, is if you don't pull that animal gills out of the water, they're probably going to survive. Just cut the line, let them go. But this blew up on Twitter, and actually a lot of people on Twitter ended up reporting this person that posted this photo, and I think she got cited for it because it was breaking the law on a critically endangered species. The problem with some of these regulations that are in the US, we make them by state. That does not include federal water. So this, again, is often a problem more in Florida. I don't know it being a huge problem off of our coastline, but Florida is the sports fishing capital of the world. People come everywhere to sports fish in Florida. And if there's a critically endangered species that is illegal to fish within US waters, some charters that I would not support take their people off far enough outside of state lines and into federal waters, and then they're able to fish that shark. At the national level, we have the Endangered Species Act, which does legally and federally protect some species. However, that does not always include everything from the IUCN. So, for example, the broad-nosed seven-gill shark is vulnerable to the IUCN Red List, but that animal is not on the Endangered Species Act. It takes a lot of legislation to actually get a species on the Endangered Species Act. There's also what you might have heard of as NIMS, the National Marine Fisheries Service. At the international level, we have CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, which, as it sounds, regulates the trade of certain products internationally. So those are some of the regulating bodies that will make some of the regulations for shark fisheries. And then the other thing that I want to touch on is different types of regulations to help species in general. One thing is marine protected areas. And the idea of those marine protected areas is to create what we call spillover effects. So ideally, if we have an area where we protect a shark, then it will have spillover effects and more sharks will be reproduced within the marine protected area and then go outside of the MPA. Now, that doesn't always work for a lot of reasons. Big one is that sharks are highly migratory. And so if there's an aggregation, like on the right, this is blacktip reef sharks. No, sorry, blacktip sharks, which are actually different. Blacktip sharks have these big aggregations. And if you know exactly when those aggregations are going to be, and maybe it's once a year, then you could create a protection on that area when they are in these big aggregations and therefore protect them during that time. But when they leave, then they're not protected, right? So it's really limited when you only put it on a certain site. It's also these MPAs, especially not necessarily in California, but in general, a lot of times MPAs can be created for and have political boundaries, not biological boundaries, right? Sharks don't know where our political boundaries are between states or between countries. And so that can be really hard to manage a species when you have to collaborate and cooperate with other states and other countries. It just gets really sticky really quick. So those are some complications with MPAs and why they might not always be effective, but they can be, especially for species that are really site specific, maybe for their whole life. Then that can be really effective. There's also shark sanctuaries, which are nationwide bans. And these are often in island nations where they can put shark sanctuaries on the whole island where you cannot fish for sharks. Again, that can be really helpful as long as the animal stays there long term. As soon as they leave those shark sanctuaries, then again, they're not protected. So those are some of the limitations to those regulations, but they can be helpful, especially when they're thought out strategically, especially if you can protect maybe the pupping ground, protect the breeding ground, and protect some really important parts of their life history, then that can be really, really helpful long term. The other thing that people try to do is make like corridors where they try to protect the whole area where a shark might be migrating. Those can be a lot more complicated. And again, we have to have a lot of data about understanding where those animals are moving. That actually was pretty affected, I believe, with whale conservation when shipping channels were actually moved, because we tracked where the whales were moving and if we could move ships into a different lane and cause less ship strikes with the whales. And that was actually pretty effective for helping decrease the amount of whales that were being beached from being hit by a ship. So there's things like that we could think of that's not necessarily a huge issue with sharks that I'm aware of. Those are different types of policies that we can think about. So these types of management plans can be really effective, but they can be fragmented sometimes, especially, again, if we're only hitting one part of their lifetime. To avoid overfishing, we have to have so much information. The other thing that I wanted to mention about those 5 species you could probably name is that sometimes those 5 species, those charismatic megafauna that you're thinking of, often also correlate with funding. Shark science is not cheap. And if you are not looking at the most critically endangered, charismatic shark out there, it is a lot less likely to get funded, especially if there's not a huge impact to the economy or to people's interest. The great white shark is definitely a more researched shark and people care about it and also are funding it. The 7-gill shark is very hard to fund. People don't know about it. Most people haven't heard about it. I would love to hear if you heard about it before this lecture today, and therefore it's less likely to get funded. That is just kind of an unfortunate part of science in general. The mascots are often going to get funded, whereas the underdogs aren't always. And sometimes people will try to connect their research with a species that is going to get funding. So you can say, hey, my species works closely with this one you really want to fund. If you really want that one to survive, you got to support this one. And that's a trick that a lot of scientists will use to try to get funding to support research that we need to understand the conservation needs of each species. A really common one, I bring that up because salmon is a really common one. People want to throw money at researching salmon because it has a huge impact on human populations. And if there's a shark that needs salmon, that is, a good correlation to make when you're applying to grant funding, because there's likely more funding that is slotted for looking at things that can regulate salmon populations, and sharks can manage salmon populations for sure if they eat them. So to avoid overfishing, we need a lot of information, and we need a lot of funding and collaboration to get the information that we need. So shark science is a huge, huge field. There is so much room here. If you're interested in shark science, there's absolutely room for you. It has not been, shark science has not been figured out. There's still so much that we're learning all the time. Like I said, we're still learning about some species. There's over 500 species. We do not know everything about every species. So the field is very wide open. There's a lot of really cool research that I'm really excited about getting into. And yeah, let me know if you're also interested in shark science, and I'd be happy to point you in the right direction. So I want to leave you with some references and resources. So if you are interested, you can continue to learn more. Feel free to screenshot this or just take a picture of it. This lecture was kind of written and guided around the paper that I wrote on the listed there on the left-hand side by Dr. Schiffman and Dr. Hammerschlag. They wrote in 2016. Some of the data in there is a little bit outdated now. I updated this lecture with the IUCN Red List. Now a whole third of sharks and rays are considered at risk or at risk for extinction, whereas I think it was only 25% in 2016 when this article was published. So keep that in mind. This is also a shameless plug for my podcast, Sharkpedia, where me and another shark scientist, we go over a shark research article with the primary author and ask them lots of questions about how they researched that shark and how they did their science and what they found. We also ask them for just anecdotal stories that happened in the field that they don't normally get to tell otherwise. So yeah, if you're interested, I hope that podcast might also be a resource for you. And then on the right-hand side, these are all people that if you're on Twitter or Instagram, I would absolutely recommend following for just general shark research, really great content and really great people to learn from. Why Sharks Matter is Dr. David Schiffman, who wrote that article on the left. And he is very well known in the shark world and in the Twitterverse. So he is on Twitter and Instagram. The individuals that have a T next to them are only found on Twitter, or IG is only on Instagram. So please do look at those resources. Those are other people that you can learn from and hopefully continue to expand your understanding of shark science. So thank you so much for your time today. Please do reach out. Hopefully I did that Twitter thread so you could follow along if you're on Twitter. If you're not, highly recommend it. The Twitter science universe is a lot of fun and I've learned a lot and even found a lot of collaborators on there. So that's also just a plug to connect with other scientists. So yeah, I hope you learned something today. Let me know and have a great day.